Helena Bottemiller Evich is the senior food and agriculture reporter for Politico. She's written a new piece called The Great FLOTUS Food Fight, which I have called the magnum opus on Michelle Obama's food policy. She joins us. I was left with the impression that Michelle Obama had accomplished what she'd set out to do in terms of food, in terms of changing the nutrition system in America, that she had succeeded. But what I think this piece does is put a sort of behind-the-scenes face on what we hadn't had a conversation about, and that's the slog of trying to get some of these policies implemented. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the what our reporting really found was that, Americans they remember certain parts of this childhood obesity effort. They might remember the push-up contest with Ellen or her mom dancing, or certainly they've seen images of the garden on the south lawn of the White House, which were, really symbols that get people talking about health and thinking about food and healthy eating and being active. But what really has been less examined and less reported on, and I think much less acknowledged, is this other more substantive policy side, not only working with federal agencies, but also the private sector. So really telling that story, I think it's a story that really hasn't been told. So people probably don't realize that the East Wing, which is the other side of the White House, so the president's in the West Wing and the First Lady's in the East Wing, was very influential in updating nutrition labels. I mean, nutrition facts are on every food package that we pick up at the grocery store. They also got rid of the food pyramid and helped design My Plate to simplify nutrition messaging for people. And then, of course, I think the more well-known one is they helped transform school lunches for 30 million children who participate in the National School Lunch Program each year.
Yeah, but the willingness, though, to make some of those changes, like when you point out the American Beverage Association reached out to the White House and said, we're willing to work with you to change some of the industry standards. What do you think it was about Michelle Obama, or perhaps the topic, that allowed for such willingness to change?
I think part of it was fear. If you think back to, when the Obamas come to D.C., there was this really strong feeling of excitement, even among people who did not vote for them. He was a historic. We have the first African-American president. They're young. There's going to be a young family in the White House. Michelle Obama has always been a very popular figure. So to have that family, to have that administration take on this issue at that time was, wow. I think there was, from the food industry's perspective, there was definitely a sense of, well, what exactly does she want to do? This could be, this could be sort of a formidable, we certainly don't want her to be our foe, right? So I think the willingness to reach out and to try to figure out ways to work with her, really happened from the get-go. The industry wanted to know if they had a place in the initiative, and the White House envisioned working with the food industry because, quite frankly, you can sometimes get, or oftentimes get, faster change in the private sector if you convince companies to do things on their own. I mean, the FDA certainly can't get food companies to agree to cut 6.4 trillion calories out of the food supply, but that was one thing the East Wing was able to negotiate.
Yeah, which is extremely impressive. I mean, and the speed at which...
Every little bit helps, yeah.
Yeah. So. Tell me about Sam Cass, who was a friend of the Obamas and also a chef that worked very closely with them, and his role in sort of navigating policy and pushing these things through in terms of talking to Congress and negotiating and getting some of this policy going.
I think it's really, it's hard to overstate the role that he played throughout his time in the administration. I mean, he was there about 6 years, but as you mentioned, they were friends before the Obamas got to the White House. So Sam Cass actually started working for the family, helping them prepare meals back when now President Obama, was then Senator Obama. It was right around the time when he first launched his campaign in 2007. And, Sam Cass had kind of always known the Obamas around the neighborhood. They're both from Hyde Park. And, Michelle Obama basically reaches out and says, I need help. The pediatrician for the family had raised some red flags about the girl's body mass index potentially going in the wrong direction. There were some health issues that were raised, and they decided to make some changes. And so he's really instrumental in the family's sort of personal story and relationship with food and health and nutrition. So they then bring him to the White House, and he's the assistant chef there, and he cooks for the family. But he ends up taking this very instrumental role in Let's Move, in the creation of Let's Move. He's the one who reaches out and brings in a lot of the experts to come to the White House. And then increasingly, as years go by, he becomes even more influential in sort of directing the agencies and prodding the agencies to move faster, to get these policies out, get them moving. And it's, the way Washington works, you sometimes need that person to light fires under, whether or not it's, the FDA or USDA, and kind of have the trains run on time. And he really assumed that role. I mean, the First Lady, as far as we can tell, was not calling the federal agencies. She wasn't showing up on Capitol Hill. But Sam Cass was able to be that sort of gatekeeper and conductor behind the scenes.
Was that sort of the strategy for Michelle Obama, to sort of stay away from getting involved in the politics or making it sort of a political issue, instead use Sam Cass to go and do some of these things?
Yeah, one of the points we really make in the story is that the effort seems to really draw from lessons learned from past First Ladies. So there seems to be this balance that's constantly being struck between her being, the public figure, the public face, the public cheerleader for this effort, and then at certain times, the behind-the-scenes lobbyist. But it's pretty rare for her to be the one really, up to her elbows in policy. She really left that to her staff. So I think, certainly everyone points to the Hillary Clinton example, right? If a First Lady gets too publicly involved in policy, there have been ramifications for that. There was a pretty stiff backlash. But what's interesting is almost every modern First Lady, and even, First Ladies going back to Abigail Adams, we talked to a lot of historians for this story, and almost all of them are involved in policy to one extent or another. I mean, there are numerous examples. Lady Bird Johnson, of course, was very well known for beautifying America, and a lot of people credit her for the reason we don't still throw trash out of our car windows. So, and there are numerous examples, but I think it's interesting. People don't necessarily think of First Ladies wearing the policy hat, but they certainly do.
But this was a policy that she was talking about years before she was even in the White House, right?
Yeah, so we actually found, you can go back to 2005, so more than a decade ago, she meets with the head of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the country's largest health foundation. They work very, very intensely on childhood obesity. And, the First Lady was even telling her personal story, about the family's health changes and how hard it is for families to make healthy choices with the head of this foundation back in 2005. So her interest goes, way back. One of the interesting, side stories here is the way that staff saw the Affordable Care Act and the childhood obesity initiative sort of dovetailing each other, right? So if you're going to be reforming healthcare, you can't even have that conversation without starting to talk about prevention. I mean, that's a huge way to reduce costs. So almost no one publicly saw these efforts as related, but one of the things as we talked to staff, we interviewed more than 60 people for this story, we started to really hear a recognition that those were seen behind the scenes as kind of dual efforts or complementary efforts.
We've talked about a lot of the accomplishments. What were the major challenges for her?
Yeah, school lunch certainly has been the most public and controversial piece of this. There's been, the social media backlash. There's a Thanks Michelle Obama hashtag that gets used on Twitter, basically from students posting unappetizing pictures of their lunches. The School Nutrition Association, which represents the school lunch, we call them the school lunch ladies. That's technically not the most politically correct term. There are lots of men who are leading school lunch programs as well, but that's how we think of them. They end up, they're supportive of the law, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, which they passed, which sort of was the foundation for these changes. But then once the details and the changes start to come out, and they realize kind of how much change is going to be asked of them in their school cafeteria programs, they end up kind of switching gears and fighting many of the changes. So that was an enormous challenge for the White House. The House Republicans really start, I think they sort of seize the opportunity to take on what they see as another, federal government overreach, and there was a lot of back and forth, language being inserted into appropriations bills to try to get schools to be able to opt out. I mean, there was all sorts of public fighting, and it ends up getting, by about 2014, quite bitter. Things have calmed down now, and much of the program's changes have been preserved, but for a long time it was a pretty ugly fight. And I think, at one point advocates start to think, does the First Lady at some time, does her involvement sometimes make this a bigger target, right? That this can become more political because it's seen associated with her. So that was a big challenge. There were many others. I mean, the White House, when the First Lady launches Let's Move at the White House in 2010, she pledges to end food deserts. So, food deserts are communities where it's very difficult to get fresh food or healthy food, or maybe they don't have access to a grocery store. The White House has certainly not ended food deserts. It remains, a very critical problem in many, many communities. There are also a couple other chapters that the story doesn't go into as much. One of the big chapters that health advocates are still upset about is the fact that the White House did not take a harder line on limiting junk food marketing to children. And one of the problems with that policy fight is the way that it happened in Washington. It kind of, basically there was this interagency working group that set forth voluntary recommendations. Companies should use these health criteria when they're going to, market cereal or, fruit leather or whatever to kids. It was voluntary, and it happened to get released about a year before the 2012 re-election. And right before the re-election, you certainly see a pullback from the White House, not wanting to do anything too controversial, anything too anti-business, because, of course, the president is running for re-election. And so, but for health advocates, they're like, we have a First Lady who cares about this issue so much, cares about childhood obesity, and the food industry spends billions of dollars marketing less than healthy food to kids. So, they were very disappointed that the White House did not go to bat for that. And it was, I think most people would tell you that was one of the biggest, if not the biggest disappointment of all of the work that they've done.
The Great FLOTUS Food Fight is on Politico. Helena Bottemiller Evich is a senior food and agriculture reporter for Politico. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with us.
Thanks for having me.